Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, we travel to a quiet corner of the English countryside, to a village so small it barely appears on the map, but which carries with it a story older than most families care to remember. There stands an old church, and in its crumbling tower hangs a bell. Not the usual bronze, but one painted, long ago, the colour of dried blood. The villagers call it the Crimson Bell. Tradition says it only tolls when a death has already been announced. But this time, it rang at midnight, when no one had died. Not yet. Some bells do not announce death, they summon it. Joining us tonight is a man who has spent his life listening to what others cannot hear in silence, the great Hercule Poirot. Now, let us begin. The bell that should not ring. The village of Fenning Marsh did not appear on any map that Hercule Poirot had ever consulted, and this fact alone had irritated him for the better part of the afternoon. 3 trains, Georges, 3, he said, to no one in particular, since Georges was not present and had not been present for several years now. It was merely a habit Poirot had never quite abandoned, the habit of speaking to a man who was no longer there to listen. He caught himself doing it and gave a small, private sigh. 60-something years old and still talking to an empty carriage seat. Age, he reflected, did not improve a man. It merely made his habits more visible to himself. The final train had been a rattling, reluctant thing that stopped at every hedge and cow pasture between Salisbury and nowhere, and by the time Poirot descended onto the platform of Fenning Marsh, a platform which consisted of a single bench, a station master who appeared to be asleep standing up, and a great deal of autumn mist, his moustaches had gone slightly limp with the damp, and his patience had gone with them. A car was waiting, not a very good car, but a determined one, and behind its wheel sat a young man of perhaps 30, thin in the way of men who worry more than they eat, with sandy hair combed too carefully for a face that looked as though it hadn't slept. "Monsieur Poirot?" the young man said, climbing out to open the door, a courtesy Poirot noted and approved of, even in his fatigue. "I'm Edmund Vayle, thank you. Thank you for coming all this way. I know it must seem a very foolish thing to have asked." "A bell that rings when it should not ring," said Poirot, settling himself into the seat with the particular care of a man whose feet ached, "is not, monsieur, a foolish thing. It is merely a thing without, as yet, an explanation. There is a considerable difference." Edmund Vayle did not look comforted by this. He drove in silence for a while, the headlamps carving 2 feeble tunnels through the mist, hedgerows pressing close on either side like the walls of a corridor. "You had better tell me," Poirot said at last, "from the beginning. I find that beginnings are so often skipped over by young men in a hurry to reach the frightening part. But it is in the beginning that the truth usually hides. It has more room there." Edmund's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "The bell is in St. Osyth's, the old church, up by the priory ruins. Nobody uses it now, the church I mean, except for the odd funeral, and even those have become rare since the new chapel was built in the town. But the tower's still there, and the bell." "The Crimson Bell," Poirot said. "You've heard the story then?" "I have heard a version of it, yes, from your telegram, and a rather more excitable version from your aunt's letter, which arrived, I might add, before the telegram, and did not entirely agree with it in its details. This is often the way with legends. Each teller adds a little more red to the paint. Tell me the version you yourself believe." Edmund glanced at him, a quick, assessing look, as if surprised to be asked what he believed, rather than what the village believed. "It was painted red after the Vayle who built the church died there. Fell from the tower, they say, back in the 1700s, painting the bell himself as some sort of penance. After that, the story goes, the bell won't sound unless death is already in the parish. It's rung to mark it, not to warn of it. That's the tradition. It rings after, not before. And yet 3 nights ago it rang at midnight, and nobody in Fenning Marsh had died. Nobody was even ill, beyond old Mrs. Hartleby's chest, which has been bad every winter for as long as I can remember, and is no worse than usual. The bell rope was found afterward, Monsieur Poirot, cut clean through, up in the tower, and yet it had rung, and the rope hasn't been usable in 30 years. The clapper's meant to be lashed still. It hasn't tolled properly since before I was born. My aunt believes it's meant for her. And what do you believe, Monsieur Vayle?" The young man was quiet for a long moment, the car jolting over a rut in the lane. "I believe," he said finally, "that somebody wants us to think it's meant for her, which frightens me rather more than the ghost would." Poirot settled back against the seat, folding his gloved hands over the head of his cane, and permitted himself, for the first time since Salisbury, something like satisfaction. A young man who suspected the human hand before the supernatural one, this was promising. This was, in fact, rather more promising than the case itself. "Bien," he said softly. "Now we begin to have a beginning worth the name." The house, when they reached it, was called Fenning Priory, though nothing of the original priory remained beyond a scattering of grey stones in the kitchen garden, and the name itself, clung to with the stubbornness families reserve for things that no longer exist. It was a low, rambling place, more additions than original structure, with ivy doing its patient work along one whole wing, and lamplight glowing amber in perhaps 4 windows out of what must have been 20. Poirot was received in a drawing-room that smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and, faintly, unmistakably, of the particular dried lavender scent that elderly Englishwomen seemed to keep in every drawer of every house he had ever visited in this country. Lady Constance Vayle was 70 if she was a day, seated very upright in a wing chair despite what was evidently a bad hip, with the sort of handsome, weathered face that suggested she had once been considered a great beauty and had never quite forgiven the years for taking it from her. "Monsieur Poirot," she did not rise, "I am told you are the only detective in England worth sending for. I hope that is true, because I am afraid, and I have not been afraid of anything since 1917, and I do not much care for the sensation returning to me now." "Madam," Poirot said, bowing over her offered hand, "fear is not a foolish thing in a woman who has evidently earned the right, over many years, not to feel it easily. Tell me why you have permitted it back into your house." "Because," said Lady Vayle, "I believe someone in this house wishes me dead, and has chosen to announce it 3 days in advance, using a bell that has not rung in 30 years, in order that I might spend those 3 days in the appropriate condition of terror before the thing is actually done to me. It seems to me a great deal of unnecessary theatre when a simple accident on the stairs would do the job rather more quietly, which is precisely why I do not believe it is meant to kill me at all, Monsieur Poirot. I believe it is meant to frighten me, and I should very much like to know into what." Poirot lowered himself into the chair opposite her, wincing very slightly, a twinge in the left knee that he had been ignoring since Calais, and for a moment allowed himself simply to look at her, the steadiness of the eyes, the restlessness of the hands, which did not match the eyes at all. "Then, madame," he said, "we shall discover what you are meant to be frightened of, and I suspect, though it is early yet for suspicion, that this will prove a rather more interesting question than who wishes you harm." Somewhere above them, faint through the old walls, a clock struck the half-hour. Lady Vayle's hands, in her lap, went very still. "It rings again at midnight," she said. "It has, every night, since the first time, always the same hour. You will hear it for yourself, Monsieur Poirot, and then perhaps you will believe me, or at least believe that someone wishes very much for me to believe it." The household that waits dinner at Fenning Priory was served at 8, in a dining room lit by candles rather than the electric lamps Poirot had noticed elsewhere in the house. A detail he filed away without comment, the way he filed away most details, in a drawer he did not open until he needed to. There were 5 of them at the long table, counting himself, and Poirot spent the soup course doing what he always did on such occasions, not listening to what was said, but watching how it was said, and by whom, and to whom the eyes travelled when a particular subject arose. To Lady Vayle's right sat her nephew Edmund, who ate almost nothing, and refilled his wineglass with a regularity that suggested habit rather than enjoyment. Across from him sat a woman introduced as Miss Ivy Rendon, a distant cousin, Poirot gathered, though the precise branch of the family tree was never made entirely clear to him, and he suspected this vagueness was deliberate on someone's part. She was perhaps 26, dark-haired, with the kind of composed prettiness that seemed to Poirot less like calm and more like practice. Beside her, Dr. Henry Ashworth, the local physician, invited, Lady Vayle explained, because a doctor is always useful company when one is expecting to be murdered, laughed rather too heartily at his own hostess's joke, a laugh that did not quite reach as far as his eyes. And at the foot of the table, silent for most of the meal, sat a stooped elderly man named Old Silas Merrow, who Poirot understood to be the last surviving verger of St. Osyth's, kept on by the family more from sentiment than necessity, since the church itself was scarcely used. "You will forgive me," Poirot said, when the fish had been cleared and the silence had gone on a beat too long, "if I ask questions that are perhaps indelicate for the dinner table. I find that murder, even murder which has not yet occurred, has very little patience for good manners, and I have learned it is best to match its rudeness rather than fight it." "How refreshing," said Miss Rendon, with a small smile that did not commit itself to warmth or coldness. "Most detectives in novels wait until the port is served. I am not, mademoiselle, a detective in a novel. I am merely a rather tired man who would like to go to bed at a reasonable hour, and cannot, until this matter of the bell is settled." A small ripple of laughter went round the table, genuine this time, or nearly so, and Poirot noted it too. Fear, in a room, could be measured by how quickly people laughed at a joke that was not, in truth, very funny. "Tell me, who among you believes the bell is truly, how do you say, supernatural? And who believes a human hand rang it?" There was a silence considerably less comfortable than the last one. "I don't see how it can be human," Dr. Ashworth said finally, turning his wineglass by its stem. "I examined the rope myself, the morning after. Cut clean through, old rope, mind, hadn't been used in decades, brittle as anything, but cut, not frayed. And the clapper's been lashed to the frame since before the war, wired up tight so it can't strike. I couldn't get it to move an inch with my own two hands, and I'm not a weak man." "And yet it rang," said Poirot. "And yet it rang," Edmund echoed quietly, staring at his plate. "Perhaps," old Merrow said suddenly, in a voice like a door that needed oiling, "it was never meant to be silent at all. Perhaps something merely remembered how to speak." The table went very still. Lady Vayle set down her fork with a small, precise click. "Thank you, Silas. That will do. He built it with his own hands, my lady, the Vayle who painted it. Some say he mixed his own blood into the paint to bind a promise. Silas." The old man subsided, but not before Poirot had seen something in his face that interested him a great deal more than the legend itself. Not fear, quite, but a kind of grim satisfaction, the look of a man watching a chicken come home to roost that he had long ago predicted would. "Forgive an old man's stories," Lady Vayle said, recovering her composure with visible effort. "Silas has told that particular tale to every child in this parish for 40 years. It loses nothing in the telling and gains a great deal." "On the contrary, madame," said Poirot mildly, "I find old men's stories among the most valuable things a house can offer a detective. They are so rarely invented from nothing. Somewhere in every legend is a seed of something that actually happened, even if it has grown, over the years, into a shape its original planter would not recognize." After dinner, while the others drifted toward the drawing-room and its inevitable bridge table, Poirot excused himself. His knee, he explained, required a short walk rather than a long sit, and found Edmund Vayle waiting for him in the hall with the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting on purpose. "You wanted to speak with me alone," Poirot said. "It was not a question. I didn't want to say it at the table." Edmund glanced toward the drawing-room door, lowered his voice. "My aunt's will was changed 6 weeks ago. I don't know the details. Old Hargreaves, the solicitor, is close as an oyster about it. But I know it happened, because I saw the letter come, and I saw her face after she read his reply. She hasn't been the same since. And the bell started 3 days ago. You keep thinking these two facts are connected, and you do not wish to think it, because to think it means suspecting people you have known your whole life." Edmund said nothing, which was, in its way, an answer. "Tell me, monsieur," Poirot said, resuming his slow progress down the corridor, cane tapping softly against old flagstones, who stood to benefit from the will as it was before the change. "I did, mostly. There's a little for Ivy, a pension for Silas, something for the church roof fund that never seems to get spent on the roof. But the house, the land, that was to come to me. I'm her only real family left. And now, I don't know. That's rather the trouble, isn't it? Nobody in this house knows what's in that new will except my aunt and her solicitor, and possibly Dr. Ashworth, who's been unusually attentive to her health this past month, for a man who used to complain she never let him examine her properly." Poirot stopped walking. Somewhere above them, in the depths of the old house, a clock was ticking toward 11. "Monsieur Vayle," he said slowly, "I begin to think this bell is not the mystery at all. I begin to think the bell is merely a very loud, very theatrical messenger, sent to distract every clever mind in this house, including my own, while the true business proceeds quietly elsewhere. This is often the way with the dramatic. It draws the eye precisely so that the hand may do its work unwatched. Then what do? We do, said Poirot, what I confess I would rather not do, at my age, on a cold night, with a knee that has opinions of its own about staircases. We climb the tower of St. Osyth's, monsieur, before midnight, and we wait to see, with our own eyes, exactly how a bell that cannot ring, rings. What the tower keeps. The path to St. Osyth's ran along the edge of the priory grounds, past the kitchen garden with its scattering of grey stones, and out through a lich gate so old its wood had gone the colour and texture of driftwood. Poirot did not care for the walk. The mist had thickened since the drive from the station, and it moved around the lantern Edmund carried in strange, slow curls, as though something in it were breathing. "You are certain," Poirot said, rather more to distract himself from his knee than because he doubted the answer, "that no one else knows we intend to be here tonight?" "I told no one but you, though I'll admit, my aunt has a way of finding things out without being told. Most women of her generation do. It is not sorcery, monsieur. It is merely that they have spent 60 years being underestimated and have used the time productively." The church itself, when it emerged from the mist, was smaller than Poirot had pictured. A squat Norman tower, thick-walled, with a nave that had clearly not seen a full congregation in a very long time. The door was unlocked. Old Merrow, Edmund explained, never bothered locking it. There was nothing left inside worth stealing, unless one counted the bell, and no one had ever been fool enough to try carrying that away. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and smelled of stone and candle wax long since burned away, and something else beneath it. Damp rot, perhaps, or simply the particular smell of a building that has been quietly dying for decades, while everyone politely pretends not to notice. The tower stair was a narrow spiral, worn into soft curves by centuries of feet, and Poirot climbed it slowly, one gloved hand trailing the rope that served as a banister, silently cursing, in French, so that Edmund would not understand the specifics, every step of it. At the top, the bell chamber was open to the sky through 4 narrow arches, and there it hung, the crimson bell, dark and enormous in the lantern light, its paint gone the colour of old rust rather than fresh blood, cracked in places to show grey metal beneath. A rope, new, Poirot noted, not the ancient one Ashworth had described, trailed from the wooden yoke down to a stub, cut cleanly a few feet above the floor. "There," Edmund whispered, pointing. "That's the cut end, the old rope. Someone's replaced part of it, see? That bit's new hemp, doesn't match the rest." Poirot crouched, with some difficulty, and a small grunt he did not trouble to disguise, and examined the join where old rope met new. His fingers, sensitive despite the cold, traced the knot. "A sailor's splice," he murmured, "neatly done. Not the work of a village boy playing pranks, monsieur. This is the work of someone who has tied rope before, and tied it well, and recently. Silas was in the merchant navy, before he became verger, 40 years ago, but a man does not forget his knots any more than he forgets his mother tongue. Yes, I had already begun to suspect our verger of knowing rather more about this bell than old legends alone would teach him." Poirot straightened, joints protesting, and looked up at the great dark shape above them. But knots do not explain how a lashed clapper, wired still by Dr. Ashworth's own testimony, produces a sound loud enough to wake a village. Let us see. He raised the lantern. High in the bell's mouth, where the clapper hung, a length of wire was indeed visible, wound tight around the metal tongue and lashed to the yoke above, exactly as described. And yet, Poirot noted, the wire was not rusted, as 30 years of neglect would surely have left it. It gleamed, faintly, new. "Monsieur Vayle," he said quietly, "what time is it?" Edmund checked his watch, and in the lantern light, his face had gone rather pale. 11:58. "Then I suggest," Poirot said, backing carefully toward the stair, "that we retreat a respectful distance, and watch, rather than stand directly beneath several hundredweight of iron, whose behaviour we do not yet understand." They descended half the stair and waited in the gloom of the nave below. Poirot's watch, a good deal more reliable, he privately felt, than Edmund's, ticking toward midnight in his gloved palm. The chime came first from the church clock itself, 12 slow strokes echoing off old stone. And on the last stroke, precisely on it, Poirot noted, with the interest of a man who valued precision above almost everything else, the crimson bell above them began, impossibly, to toll. It was not the great swinging peal of a bell rung properly. It was something stranger, a single, dull, resonant strike, as though the clapper had been drawn back and released by an unseen hand. Once, twice, 3 times, each blow slower than the last, the sound rolling down through the tower and out into the mist beyond, deep enough that Poirot felt it in the stones beneath his feet before he consciously heard it in his ears. Edmund had gone rigid beside him, lantern shaking very slightly in his grip. Poirot did not move. He was watching, with great attention, not the bell, which he could not in any case see clearly from where they stood, but the narrow archway of the stair leading up, and beyond it, faintly, a thread of cold night air moving past his cheek that had not been moving a moment before. When the third strike had died away into silence, he turned to Edmund with an expression that was not fear, but something closer to satisfaction, the look of a man who has just watched a magician's trick and, rather than being frightened by it, has spotted precisely where the false bottom of the box must be. "Monsieur Vayle," he said, "I do not believe your bell is haunted. I believe your bell has been wired, not with old copper gone soft with age, but with something considerably more modern. Run down through that tower, and out through a window I felt draw the air past my face, not 30 seconds before it struck." Someone is not merely retelling this legend. Someone is performing it. And a performance, unlike a curse, requires a stage, a mechanism, and, most usefully for us, an exit. He began, with some difficulty, to climb back toward the bell chamber, cane tapping an urgent rhythm against the stone. "Come, monsieur, let us see whether our ghost left his workshop untidy. In my long experience, the cleverest murderers are nearly always let down, in the end by the same small vice. They cannot resist admiring their own handiwork just a little too closely before they hide it away." At the top, the bell chamber was as they had left it, save for one thing. On the stone sill of the northern arch, half hidden beneath a curl of ivy that had crept in through the ancient window, lay a small coil of insulated wire, and beside it, gleaming faintly, a spent match. Poirot picked up neither. He simply looked at them for a long moment, and then out through the arch, into the mist, toward the dark shape of the priory house beyond, where, he now noted with interest, one window on the ground floor still burned with a low, steady light, though the hour had long since passed when a house of mourning in advance ought reasonably to have gone to sleep. "Someone in that house," he said softly, "is still awake, monsieur, and listening very carefully to make sure their bell did exactly what it was told to do. I think, before we return, we had better discover who." The light in the window. The walk back to the priory took longer than the walk out, if only because Poirot insisted on stopping twice to examine the ground beneath the tower's northern arch. First with the lantern held low, then, when that yielded nothing but wet grass and the ordinary chaos of ivy roots, on his knees, an indignity he bore with the air of a man settling an old score with his own body. "Footprints, monsieur," he said at last, straightening with a hand pressed to the small of his back, "are a great deal more useful in detective novels than in real English autumns. The ground here has been soaked and dried and soaked again so many times this month that it holds an impression for perhaps 6 hours before the damp erases it. Whoever strung that wire did so before the rain returned 2 nights ago. We are, I am afraid, some days behind our quarry." "Then how do we catch up?" "We do not chase the wire, Monsieur Vayle. We chase the reason for the wire. A man does not spend several evenings climbing a cold tower, splicing rope like a sailor, and running a modern electric contrivance up through 600 years of stonework, merely to enjoy the sound of his own cleverness. He does it because the fear it produces is useful to him. So, who in that house benefits from your aunt being afraid?" They had reached the lich gate again, and Poirot paused there, looking back once at the dark bulk of the church tower, before turning his attention to the priory itself, and to the single lit window on the ground floor, glowing amber through the thinning mist. "That is the morning room," Edmund said quietly. "It shouldn't be occupied at this hour. Then let us go and see who occupies it regardless." They approached the house from the garden side, boots silent on wet gravel, and Poirot, moving with a stealth that rather surprised his companion, given the volume of his complaints about his knee not 20 minutes earlier, drew close enough to the window to see inside without being seen himself. Dr. Ashworth stood at the morning-room desk, a small travelling clock in one hand, comparing it, Poirot noted with great interest, against a wristwatch on the other. On the desk before him lay a coil of wire, identical to the one left in the bell tower, and a battery of the kind used in motor-car lamps. Edmund, at Poirot's shoulder, made a small strangled sound that was fortunately absorbed by the mist. Poirot laid a gloved hand on the young man's arm, a warning, not a comfort, and continued to watch. Ashworth set down the clock, glanced at his own watch once more, made a small note in a leather book, and then, to Poirot's mild surprise, began methodically coiling the wire and placing it, along with the battery, into a doctor's bag rather more suited to house calls than sabotage. "He is timing it," Poirot breathed, comparing the striking of the bell against his own watch. "This is not the behaviour of a man merely proud of his mischief, monsieur. This is the behaviour of a man conducting an experiment." They did not have long to speculate further. A floorboard creaked somewhere behind them, the unmistakable weight shift of a person standing rather than walking, and Poirot turned, cane already lifting defensively, to find not an assailant, but Miss Ivy Rendon, wrapped in a dark coat over her nightdress, regarding them both with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and something closer to relief. "I saw you both from my window," she said quietly, "going out toward the church, and now creeping about the garden like a pair of burglars. I take it you heard the bell too." "We did rather more than hear it, mademoiselle. We watched it happen, and now we watch its author counting the minutes on his own watch, as though checking his work against a formula." Poirot inclined his head toward the lit window. "Tell me, does Dr. Ashworth often keep such hours?" Something in Ivy Rendon's face shifted, a decision being made, Poirot thought, rather than a fact being recalled. "He's been treating Lady Vayle for a heart condition these past 2 months. Digitalis, I believe, though he's never said so outright. I've seen the bottles. He comes at odd hours because her spells come at odd hours." She hesitated. "But I don't think that's what you're seeing tonight, is it?" "No, mademoiselle. I think tonight we are seeing a man rehearse a fright, so that he may measure precisely how it lands upon a heart already weakened by whatever it is he has, or has not, been prescribing it." Poirot's voice had gone very quiet, very even, the tone, Edmund would later say, of a man who has stopped speculating and begun, instead, to see. "Tell me, who inherits, mademoiselle, if Lady Vayle's heart should simply, one night, stop, from fright alone, with no mark upon her and no suspicion attached to anyone?" Ivy Rendon did not answer at once. When she did, her voice had lost its earlier composure entirely. "I don't know what's in the new will. Nobody does. But I know Dr. Ashworth asked Hargreaves' clerk about it directly. Bribed him, I think, though the boy denied it when I pressed him. And I know," she added, more quietly still, glancing back toward the lit window, "that he asked me, 3 weeks ago, whether I thought Lady Vayle's heart could survive a very great shock. He said it was a professional question. I did not entirely believe him even then." They did not confront the doctor that night. Poirot was firm on this point, over Edmund's evident and rather understandable impatience. "A man surprised at his own desk, monsieur, has 100 convenient half-truths ready before he has even looked up from his work. Better he does not know we have seen him at all, until we know precisely what it is we have seen. A doctor who frightens a woman's heart is a serious matter, but it is not, in itself, a crime the law can easily name. We must know why, and we must know it before he strikes at that heart in earnest rather than in rehearsal." It was as they crossed back toward the kitchen door, Ivy Rendon having slipped ahead of them, unwilling to be seen returning with the 2 men, that Poirot stopped abruptly in the dark of the herb garden, one hand raised. "Monsieur Vayle, that new will, you said no one knew its contents but your aunt and her solicitor." "That's right. And yet Dr. Ashworth bribes a clerk to learn them, and asks Mademoiselle Rendon whether a shock might stop your aunt's heart, and tonight rehearses, with a stopwatch, the very fright he intends to deliver. This is the behaviour, monsieur, of a man who already knows what the will contains, and who has decided that a change to it threatens him a very great deal more than it benefits him. Poirot's eyes, in the darkness, had taken on the particular brightness Edmund would come to recognize over the following days as the surest sign that the little detective had stopped merely observing and begun, instead, to know, though not yet, crucially, to know everything. You think the will was changed against him? I think, monsieur, that we have been asking the wrong question all evening. We have asked who benefits from your aunt's death. We have not yet asked, and I confess I should have asked it 3 hours ago, which troubles me rather more than I care to admit at my age. Who benefits from her death occurring before a will already signed can be properly witnessed and enrolled? Poirot turned toward the house, his expression unusually grim. Tell me, monsieur, when, precisely, is your aunt's new will to be formally executed? Edmund's face, pale already in the moonlight, went paler still. Tomorrow, he said. Hargreaves is coming at 11, with the second witness. I only remembered because Aunt Constance mentioned it at breakfast, rather offhand. She said she wanted it settled before the bell has its way with her. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, the fatigue Edmund had noticed since the station platform had been entirely burned away by something sharper. Then, monsieur, we have considerably less time than I believed we had an hour ago. Whatever Dr. Ashworth intends, I do not think he intends to wait for a fourth night of bells to do it. Before the ink. Dries Poirot did not sleep that night. Or rather, he permitted himself 2 hours of it, sitting upright in an armchair in the small guest room he had been given, cane across his knees like a man standing sentry rather than resting, before rising again well before dawn with the particular stiffness of joints that had not forgiven him for the tower stairs. He found Lady Vayle already awake when he came down, seated in the same wing chair as the evening before, a shawl about her shoulders and a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, untouched. You did not sleep either, Monsieur Poirot. I can always tell. There is a particular grey, a face goes. Madam, I have spent the night discovering that your bell is not haunted, but I am afraid the news does not comfort as much as it should. A ghost, madame, wishes only to frighten. A living man who frightens so precisely, so scientifically, generally wishes for a great deal more, he told her then, plainly and without ornament, the wire, the rehearsal, the stopwatch, Ashworth's questions to Ivy Rendon about the endurance of a frightened heart. Lady Vayle listened without visible reaction, her hands folded in her lap, and when he had finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I did wonder, she said at last, why he began attending me so devotedly this past month, when for the 10 years before that he was content to see me twice a year and grumble about my refusing his advice. I put it down to vanity. Doctors dislike being ignored. She looked up at Poirot, and for the first time since his arrival, he saw the fear beneath the composure fully, unguarded. Tell me plainly, monsieur, am I in danger today? I believe, madame, that today is the day your danger was always aimed at. Your solicitor arrives at 11 to complete the new will. I must ask you, forgive the indelicacy, what changes have you made, and who stands to lose by them? Lady Vayle's mouth tightened, but she did not evade the question, and Poirot found himself, not for the first time in his career, admiring the particular courage of the very old, who have generally run out of patience for pretending. I have left the bulk of the estate to Edmund, as it always was to be, but I have removed a smaller legacy, £5,000, that was, in the old will, left to Henry Ashworth. He was very good to my late husband in his final illness. I believed, once, that I owed him something for it. I have since learned, she said, with the flat precision of a woman choosing her words very carefully, that his devotion during that illness was rather better explained by the morphia he was so generous in prescribing, and rather less by affection. Poirot went very still. Madame, are you telling me that you suspect Dr. Ashworth of hastening your husband's death? I am telling you, Monsieur Poirot, that I have suspected it for 11 years, and said nothing, because I had no proof beyond an old woman's instinct, and because dead husbands cannot be unburied by suspicion alone. But I began, some months ago, to make quiet inquiries, through Hargreaves, discreetly, into the dosages recorded at the time, and I believe Henry Ashworth learned of those inquiries a good deal sooner than I intended him to. And the £5,000 removed from the will was never really about the money, monsieur. It was my way of telling him, without confrontation, that I knew, or suspected. A private message, from one careful person to another. I see now, she added, very quietly, that it was perhaps not so private as I believed. Poirot rose from his chair with sudden decision, the fatigue of the sleepless night falling away from him like a discarded coat. "Madame, I must ask you to do something that will feel, to a woman of your temperament, entirely unnatural. I must ask you to be afraid, convincingly for the next several hours, and to let Dr. Ashworth believe his bell has done its work rather better than it truly has. Can you manage this?" For the first time since his arrival, Lady Constance Vayle smiled, a small, sharp thing, more dangerous than any fear. "Monsieur Poirot, I have been performing the emotions expected of a well-bred Englishwoman for 70 years. I believe I can manage one morning more." The household gathered for breakfast in an atmosphere Poirot privately judged to be the most valuable kind of tense. Everyone aware something had shifted overnight, no one certain what. Edmund, following Poirot's whispered instruction in the hallway, said nothing of the tower. Ivy Rendon, for her part, kept her eyes on her plate with the careful stillness of a woman who has decided that silence is, for now, her safest position. Dr. Ashworth arrived at 9:30, ostensibly to check on Lady Vayle's heart before the excitement of the solicitor's visit, a solicitude Poirot now watched with entirely new eyes, noting the careful way the doctor took her pulse, the slightly too long pause before he pronounced it, a little rapid but nothing alarming, given the circumstances. "You have been under a considerable strain, Lady Vayle," Ashworth said, snapping his bag shut. "That business with the bell, I confess I do not know what to make of it myself, but I would counsel you most strongly against excitement of any kind today. Perhaps postpone Hargreaves' visit. There is no urgency, surely, in signing a document a week later than planned." "On the contrary, Henry," Lady Vayle said, with a composure Poirot found himself admiring even as he understood every ounce of effort it cost her. "I find urgency to be exactly the medicine I require. A woman who believes a bell is calling her name does not wish to leave her affairs unsettled a single day longer than necessary. Hargreaves comes at 11, as arranged." Something moved behind Dr. Ashworth's eyes, swift, controlled, but not swift enough to escape Poirot's attention entirely. "As you wish, of course," he said. "I shall stay a while longer, if I may, in case the strain proves too much." "How very good of you," said Poirot pleasantly, from his seat by the window, "to be so constantly at hand, Monsieur le Docteur, exactly when it matters most." The look Ashworth turned on him was brief, but it confirmed something Poirot had already begun to suspect beyond doubt. The doctor knew, now, that his audience of one in the mist last night had not gone unnoticed after all. It was shortly before 11, as the household waited for Hargreaves's car to be heard on the gravel, that the second incident occurred. Not a bell this time, but something considerably closer to home. Lady Vayle's afternoon tea, brought early, at her own request, to steady her nerves before the solicitor's arrival, sat on the small table beside her chair, and it was Ivy Rendon, crossing the room to close a window against the autumn chill, who happened to glance down into the cup and frown. "Aunt Constance, did you take sugar in this? There's a residue at the bottom that doesn't look right." Poirot was across the room before the sentence had finished, examining the cup with the swift, absolute focus that erased for a moment every trace of the tired old man who had complained about trains the day before. A faint white sediment clung to the porcelain, not fully dissolved. "Do not drink it, madame," he said sharply, though Lady Vayle had made no move to. "Monsieur Vayle, fetch Dr. Ashworth. Tell him nothing beyond that his patient requires him urgently." "He's in the library," Edmund said, already moving. "No," Poirot said, and something in his voice stopped the young man mid-stride. "I think, monsieur, we shall bring the cup to the library and watch very carefully what the good doctor's face does when he sees it." He lifted the cup himself, with the delicate care of a man handling evidence rather than crockery, and led the way, Edmund, Ivy, and a visibly unsettled Lady Vayle following, toward the library, where Henry Ashworth stood at the window, watch in hand, checking the time with an urgency that, when he turned and saw them enter, he could not entirely conceal. "Doctor," Poirot said, holding the cup out before him like an accusation-made porcelain, "I wonder if you would be so kind as to tell us exactly what this residue is. As Lady Vayle's physician, I am sure you will recognize it at once. For the length of perhaps 3 seconds, Henry Ashworth's careful composure did not merely crack. It fell away entirely, and what showed beneath it was not the shame of a man caught, but something colder and considerably more dangerous. The calculation of a man deciding, in real time, whether the moment for pretense had finally passed. "I have no idea what you mean, Monsieur Poirot," he said, but his eyes had already gone to the clock on the library mantel, and Poirot, following that glance, understood with sudden, complete clarity that the true danger of the morning had not yet arrived at all. It was still, even now, ticking its way toward them. 11 o'clock, Monsieur le Docteur," Poirot said softly. "The hour Hargreaves arrives to make Lady Vayle's new will irrevocable. I wonder, did you plan for her heart to fail before his car reached the gate, or merely believe that a woman frightened badly enough these past 3 nights, and dosed carefully enough this morning, would not survive the shock of one more surprise before the ink was ever allowed to dry?" The bell's true purpose. For a long moment, nobody in the library moved. The clock on the mantel ticked on, indifferent, and somewhere far off, absurdly, comically ordinary against the weight of the moment, a car could be heard turning in at the priory gates. Hargreaves, precisely on time. "You are mistaken," Ashworth said finally, but the words came too fast, too thin, a man reciting a line he had rehearsed for a different, easier scene. "I have devoted 2 months to Lady Vayle's care. You would hardly poison the very cup you prescribed her doctor's regimen to accompany. On the contrary, monsieur, I think it is precisely because you have spent 2 months establishing yourself as her devoted physician that you believed no one would think to look twice at a residue in her tea, on the very morning a change of will was to be made permanent. A weak heart, already strained by 3 nights of terror, at a bell no one could explain, and then, on the 4th morning, a final shock, timed to arrive before the solicitor's car reached the gate. A death that would surprise no one, grieve everyone, and require no explanation beyond an old woman's heart, worn down at last by an old family curse come home to roost. It is, I confess, Monsieur le Docteur, an almost elegant plan, almost. You cannot possibly prove any of this." "No?" Poirot set the teacup down upon the library table with exaggerated, almost theatrical care, the gesture of a man laying down a final card. "Let us see what we can prove, and let the rest assemble itself as it will. Item the first, a length of insulated wire and a spent match, left carelessly upon the sill of the bell tower's northern window. Wire, which, I have no doubt, will be found to match precisely the coil in your medical bag, which Edmund Vayle and I watched you pack away with our own eyes at midnight last night, having watched you first time, with a stopwatch, the tolling of a bell you yourself had wired to strike." Ivy Rendon made a small, sharp sound. Lady Vayle did not move at all, her eyes fixed on Ashworth's face with an intensity that had nothing left in it of the frightened old woman she had performed so well that morning. "Item the second," Poirot continued. "A clerk in Hargreaves' office, bribed, clumsily, I am given to understand, to reveal the contents of a will not yet legally his to know, which revealed to you that a legacy you had long counted upon was to be removed, and removed for a reason you understood better than anyone else in this house, because Lady Vayle had begun, quietly, to inquire into the dosages you administered to her late husband during his final illness 11 years ago." Ashworth's face had gone the colour of old paper. "Item the third, and I think, monsieur, the item which will trouble you most, in the account you must one day render, not to me, but to a jury, a cup of tea, brought to this room not 5 minutes ago, containing a residue which I suspect, though I am no chemist, a proper analysis will identify as a considerably more generous dose of the digitalis you have been so carefully, so gradually, administering to a heart you had every professional reason to know could not indefinitely withstand it." "This is—" Ashworth's voice cracked, steadied, cracked again. "This is speculation, dressed up as certainty. You have no witness to the tea. You have wire and a match, which prove nothing beyond a foolish prank." "A prank, monsieur?" Poirot's voice, for the first time since Fenning Marsh, lost every trace of gentleness. A prank does not require a man to study a household's habits closely enough to know precisely when its mistress takes her tea, alone, in a room he can enter unobserved. A prank does not require the careful counting of seconds between a church clock's chime and a bell's response, so that terror might be delivered with the precision of a metronome. You did not play a prank upon this family, Dr. Ashworth. You conducted an experiment in exactly how much fear a failing heart could absorb before it gave out entirely, and when 3 nights proved insufficient, you decided this morning to help it along. The library door opened. Old Merrow stood in the frame, looking older and greyer than he had at dinner the evening before, and behind him, unmistakably, the sound of Hargreaves's voice in the hall, exchanging pleasantries with a footman, entirely unaware of what he was walking into. "I heard," Merrow said quietly into the silence. "Forgive me, my lady. I did not mean to listen, but the library door does not shut properly and never has. I have known, these past weeks, that something was not right with the good doctor's visits. I said nothing, because I had no proof, only an old sailor's instinct for a man rigging something he does not wish observed." He looked, not at Ashworth, but at Poirot. "I did not lie to you at dinner, monsieur. I do believe something in that bell remembered how to speak. I simply believed, until last night, that it was remembering on its own. I understand now it was taught." It was in the end a curiously quiet unravelling. Poirot had half expected, had, if he was honest with himself, some small theatrical part of him almost hoped for, a dramatic confession, a lunge for the door, some final flourish worthy of the crimson bell and its blood-dark legend. Instead, Henry Ashworth simply sat down, rather heavily, in the chair nearest the window, and put his face in his hands, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of its earlier steadiness. "I did not mean for it to go so far," he said, to no one in particular. "The bell was only ever meant to frighten her into abandoning the inquiries, into believing the family curse was stirring, so that she would stop digging into a death 11 years buried, and let an old man's mistake stay buried with it. I told myself, for 2 months, that I was managing her fear, not creating it. And then the will came, and I understood she had already decided what she believed, wire or no wire, bell or no bell, and I panicked, and this morning I did something I have spent 2 months telling myself I was too civilized a man to ever actually do. You administered a fatal dose to a woman whose confidence in you as her physician you had spent 11 years cultivating," Poirot said, "without cruelty, but without mercy either. That is not panic, monsieur. That is merely the final, logical conclusion of every choice that came before it. Panic is what a man feels before he acts against his conscience. What you describe is what a man feels after, when the acting is done and the conscience, a little late, returns to collect its due." Hargreaves arrived in the library not 2 minutes later to find a scene he would describe, for years afterward, at every dinner party discreet enough to ask him about it, as the strangest morning of his professional life. A solicitor's client very much alive and considerably more composed than he had feared. A doctor sitting silent and grey in an armchair, watched over by a footman Poirot had quietly summoned, and a small, moustached foreign gentleman explaining, with the calm precision of a man reading out a shopping list, exactly how a bell painted the colour of blood 2 centuries ago had very nearly finished, in one autumn, what a family legend had merely threatened for 300 years. The will, in the end, was signed as planned, a small irony Lady Vayle herself pointed out, with the dry humour of a woman who had very recently stared down her own death, and found, on the other side of it, that she rather resented having wasted 3 sleepless nights on a man not worth the fear. Edmund Vayle inherited the estate that had always, in truth, been meant for him. The legacy once intended for Henry Ashworth was struck from the document entirely, in the end, by his own hand-delivered confession to the local constabulary within the week, a confession that spared the family a public trial, though not, Poirot privately suspected, the doctor himself the fuller reckoning that awaited him. Poirot left Fenning Marsh 3 days later, on a morning considerably brighter than the one on which he had arrived, the mist burned away by a pale autumn sun that made the old church tower, glimpsed once more from the departing car, look almost ordinary, a squat grey building, with nothing more sinister about it than damp stone and old ivy. "You solved it in 4 days," Edmund said, driving him back toward the little station with its single bench and its perpetually drowsing station-master. "I confess, Monsieur Poirot, when I sent that telegram, I half expected you to tell me I was chasing shadows." Ah, but you were not chasing shadows, monsieur. You were chasing a very carefully constructed echo of one, which is, I think, the cleverer trick and the more dangerous kind of lie. A man who invents a ghost from nothing is easily caught, because ghosts, upon close examination, tend to dissolve. But a man who borrows an existing legend, 300 years old and already believed by an entire village, and simply gives it, very quietly, a modern voice, that man is harder to catch, because half the work of convincing you has already been done for him by dead ancestors and old wives' tales, long before he ever lifts a finger of wire. He was quiet for a moment, watching the hedgerows slide past, and when he spoke again, it was with something almost like weariness. "I will confess to you, monsieur, since I do not think I shall pass this way again, I nearly missed it. That first night, in the tower, I was so pleased with myself for finding the wire that I very nearly stopped there, satisfied that I had explained the how and need not trouble myself further with the why. It was your aunt, in the end, who gave me the why, when she admitted what she truly suspected of her husband's death. A detective who is too tired, or too vain, to keep asking why a clever trick was built, deserves rather less credit than the trick itself. You don't strike me as a man given much to vanity, Monsieur Poirot. Every man is given to vanity, monsieur, who has been right often enough, for long enough, that he begins to trust the feeling of being right rather more than the evidence that earns it. I am no exception. I am simply old enough now to notice it happening, and to catch myself, most of the time, before it costs someone their life, rather than merely my own pride." He allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Most of the time, monsieur. Not, I think, all of it. That is perhaps the most any of us, detective or otherwise, can honestly claim. The train, when it arrived, was no more punctual or comfortable than the one that had brought him. Poirot boarded it all the same, settled into a window seat with the particular relief of a man whose knee had earned a long rest, and watched Fenning Marsh, its bell tower, its mist, its old grey stones, recede slowly into the ordinary, sunlit distance behind him. Somewhere behind that mist, he knew, the crimson bell hung silent once more in its tower, its wire long since removed, its legend restored, for the villagers who told it to their children, to the safer, older shape it had worn for 300 years. A story about a bell that only rang for grief already given, never for grief still to come. But Hercule Poirot, watching the fields go by, permitted himself the private, unshared knowledge that no legend, however old, was ever entirely to be trusted at its word. For a bell, like a man, could always, with sufficient patience and sufficient wire, be taught to say something other than the truth it was built to tell. "Some bells," he murmured to the empty carriage, in a voice too quiet for even Georges, had he been there, to hear, "do not announce death, they summon it. But it is never, mes amis, the bell that does the summoning. It is always, in the end, merely a man.